Hello and welcome back to a brand new video. My name is Tony King and it's a rainy day. It's a dark, gloomy day. So what's a cozier vibe than doing some photo editing? Now these are photos I already edited and have shared on my Instagram at Tony King Pics, but I've had some questions recently on my YouTube channel. How do I edit my photos? And so today I want to go through editing the light in my photos. I edit in Camera Raw on Photoshop or in Lightroom. They're pretty much the same, but I usually just do it in Photoshop and then I export to JPEGs from there. And that's what I share on YouTube. That's what I share on Instagram. Most of what I edit is under the light tab in Camera Raw. There are other tabs like color, which can affect white balance, vibrance, and saturation. Usually I don't touch those, but I will put maybe a +12 on vibrance. But today I'm gonna go over exclusively my edits on light. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So this is from the plane with the sun coming down out of the clouds really nicely. So let's go ahead and jump into the light of this edit. So I'm gonna go ahead and put my blacks down to about -76 to really bring out some of that contrast from the wing and show what the clouds are looking like, with my whites coming up, kind of building some of that contrast that I'm gonna edit some more even later. Shadows down. So a lot of times you'll bring up the shadows, but here I'm gonna bring them down. I really want this contrast and those clouds and that light coming out of the clouds to really be accentuated. Highlights can also come down so we get a little bit more detail in the bright parts. Bring the contrast up and we see how this is all forming with color. And lastly, plus 0.15 on the exposure. We just have a completely well exposed image and I'm happy with how this one turned out. Here we have a pretty matter-of-fact shot of the front-facing side of a building with these nice blue awnings and like kind of this off-white look for the wall. So I'm gonna go ahead and up that contrast to +51. I do overuse the contrast a bit. Maybe that's frowned upon sometimes, but I don't mind it. Then I'm gonna put down the highlights to -80, really get the detail out of that wall since it is a brightly colored wall. Drop some shadows again. There are really nice shadows from the kind of columns near the awning. So there's a lot of nice detail. Up the whites and drop the blacks just a little bit. So +24 and -26. And here we have a nice vibey image from Venice, Italy. Next up, we have this gondolier sitting, waiting. He's not perfectly sharp, but sharp enough for me. Let's go ahead and I'm gonna raise that contrast by 50, drop the highlights by 83, so we can see really the details on the stairs and on like the pavement. But he's a little dark, so we're gonna raise the shadows just to 35, up the whites a little bit. We also see him a little bit more there, and drop the blacks to get that contrast. I don't touch the exposure. Here is another photo that is kind of nice and moody, a lot of empty negative space, so happy with it. Here I have an interesting layered image of the Rialto Bridge. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop the blacks to -26, up the whites to 24, which is kind of my standard go-to baseline. Then I'm gonna raise the shadows so we can really see the yellow of the Rialto on this dock. Lower the highlights, get a little bit more detail out of the bridge. Up the contrast, as always, to about 50, but then it's a little overexposed, so I'm gonna drop the exposure by -0.65. I usually try not to edit the exposure because I try to get it right the first time when I'm taking a photo, but I didn't quite do that today, so here we go. I think this is a nice kind of cinematic image here. Next up, an image I have received a lot of questions about is this gondolier with, a group here. It's a photo that I really like, really nice shape to it. I've shared it in a couple different aspect ratios as well, but I quite like this photo. I'm dropping the exposure by -0.5, just a slight touch. Sometimes I can be a kind of perfectionist or kind of picky with that. Again, editing is all super subjective, so maybe you like it, maybe you don't. gonna up that contrast really high. Now you can see he's a little hidden. Gonna lower the highlights so we get a little bit of detail on the water, then up the shadows so we can see his shape a little bit more. And the whites and blacks are gonna be +24 and -26, pretty much as they always are. So this is a nice photo here. I think we have enough detail on his face and in his body, but there's still a little bit of obscured shadow aspect because he is, really a silhouette with the light coming from behind him. Next up is this shot of this bell tower in Venice, kind of obscured by an object, another building in the front. How can we get a little bit more life out of this image? I'm not going to touch the exposure here. I'm going to up the contrast to +53 so we can see a little bit more detail on the kind of top of the bell tower there. Then drop the highlights so that, the bell tower and the sky kind of are separated, especially on that right-hand side. Up the shadows so there's a little bit more detail on the obstructing wall. And then up the whites by 10, minus the blacks by 45, and we have a very contrasty, deep image with amazing color quality. Here's an interesting shot of like a window with a little balcony and a clothesline, but it doesn't have a lot of character and depth here. So I'm going to up that contrast, really bring out the shadows. Now there's already a little bit more drama. I'm going to drop the highlights so that yellow is quite strong, and especially kind of where the door is, there's like 3 different colors right there. They come out when you drop those highlights. I'm gonna up the shadows just a smidge to 50, the whites to +10, and drop the blacks to really get a lot of contrast there. I don't mind having things lost in pure black in the shadows. It's kind of the goal here, to kind of create a little bit more drama, intrigue, and kind of interest in this scene. Here's one of my favorite shots in black and white from my trip to Venice of this guy at the market beating some ice. So I'm going to up the exposure just by 0.3, up the contrast by +53, so we really get a lot of nice dramatic qualities there. The highlights are going to come down so we can see more details on his face and in what he's doing. Up the shadows just a smidge to 39, whites up to +10, and blacks down to -45. So we have really good contrast here, and we can still see all the details in the blacks and in the whites. From the market, we have a kind of nice cinematic wide angle shot of this guy working on fish or whatever. So we're gonna drop the exposure just a little bit to get some more detail out of the ice and the kind of the styrofoam, whatever you wanna call it, trays that he's working with. Up that contrast to +53. He's already sticking out from the background a little bit better. Drop the highlights so that the background isn't blown out, and with this we see a little bit more of the fish and the styrofoam trays like before. Sometimes you need to work on 2 things to get a good effect. I'm going to leave the shadows at 0, which is something I rarely do. Up the whites +10 and down the blacks to -45. Get nice contrast and color quality, and we can see all the details of what he's working on. Not too much to it. It is a nice image, made very cinematic with the bokeh and with the wide angle crop. Here, this shot is a bit overexposed, so we're gonna have to stop it down in post. This is one place where I should have done it better in real life. So I'm gonna drop that by 0.95, which is almost basically just by 1 stop in post. You don't wanna do this too much, but it works here. I think between like -1 and +1 is a safe margin in Camera Raw for most images. Up that contrast to +53. I really like the shadow on his face, so we want to see that. So drop the highlights, and I think this is going to do it for the shadows. So I'm going to skip over the shadows, leave those at 0, +10 on the whites, and -45 on the blacks. Now we have a very nice vibey image with some cinematic quality where you can see the details, but there's a lot of contrast and depth to the image. Next up, we have a shot here with a really nice shadow on the left, but a guy kind of in the bright sunlight on the right. So how are we gonna manage that? Well, we're gonna up the contrast to +53 so we can really get a little bit of texture between the shadow and the bright part of the column, and on the shadow that he's casting on his own shirt, but his shirt is slightly overexposed. So we're gonna drop those highlights down to -87, which brings more detail to his shirt, but also affects the column in the front, which proves that it's not just a fully white column. It's got a kind of off color, which I think adds a little bit of texture to this image because the guy's shirt is actually pure white. So then we're gonna drop the shadows a little bit to bring out even more of that shadow. Really kind of, because of the shape of it, it can point to the guy working on whatever I think he's crushing a water bottle. Up the whites by +10 and drop the blacks to -45. Very contrasty image. Let me know what you think. We have a big scene here with the woman kind of sitting in front of San Giorgio, so I'm focusing on the woman with the big church in the back. Let's go ahead and drop the exposure just to -0.45 so we can get a little bit more detail out of everything. Up the contrast to +53, down the highlights to -87, bringing them really, really low. Skip over the shadows, no shadow edits here, +10 on the whites and -45 on the blacks. That kind of creates a little bit more depth to this image, and she sticks out from the water behind her, with where we can still see kind of the dramatic, imposing, but beautiful view of the church in the background. Here's a shot that a lot of people have enjoyed of this gondolier kind of sitting here obscured in shadow. So how did I actually end up editing this photo? Well, I upped the contrast by +53, which is something I often do. I didn't touch the exposure at all. I'm gonna drop the highlights by -37, get some more details and everything in there. Drop the shadows by -5. You don't need to do too much. There's already a lot of shadows naturally in the photo. Up the whites by +10 and drop the blacks to -45 so we can really lose a lot of kind of this distracting mess in the middle. And there we go. I don't feel like I did too much here. I think I brought out enough of the detail and hid what needed to be hidden for a really nice photo. Here's a black and white shot of a gondolier going down a canal. It was very bright, but I was able to capture this shot. So I upped the contrast to +50, down the highlights just a little bit, not too much, up the shadows to get more details out of it, up the whites and drop the blacks. Very simple. This is kind of my standard style of editing, and I think there's a lot of contrast and intrigue and depth in this image. One of my personal favorites compositionally, but it needs a little bit more done with the shadows and with the contrast here. So let's up that contrast to +50, drop some of the highlights, not by too much, drop the shadows just a smidge to -6, up the whites, and then drop the blacks is gonna do the heavy lifting here. And we have a really interesting image here compositionally with the shadows on the kind of glass that has a lot of light reflecting onto it. We already have a very vibrant image here, but how can we make it a little bit more vibrant, but also highlight kind of some of the light and dark parts of this image? We're gonna go ahead and up the exposure by 0.15, and then up that contrast like I always do. Drop some of the highlights kind of halfway down to like -43. Drop the shadows just a smidge to -11. I don't wanna lose too many details in the shadows, but I want them to be accentuated. Up the whites, and drop the blacks just a little, and now we have a very contrasty, vibrant image that I think is really, really nice and kind of depicts the image of a Venetian colorful island. Next, we have this beautiful green house, very matter-of-fact shot. Let's go ahead and up that contrast and drop the highlights. We're gonna up the shadows on this one. I want to get some details out of the door and of the laundry at the top right. Up the whites and drop the blacks just a little bit. And here we have a very contrasty image. Sometimes when you add contrast, it also appears to be sharper to the eye, and that is something that this photo also needed. But really nice kind of color here to where we can still see the details in the shapes of the image, like under this doorway, which I guess a stairwell going over it. Upping some of that contrast there really accentuates the shape of the house without losing what is actually there. Another one of my favorites here, I had to up the exposure by 0.15. Then I obviously upped the contrast, but I lost a little bit of detail in the shadows. So I dropped the highlights to get, the shape of the shirt really nice. Then I upped the shadows to +73. So we can really see the texture of this kind of gritty wall behind the shirt and kind of in the foreground. Up the whites and up the blacks to +1. Very minor edit there on the blacks, but really all the details are shown and there's a dramatic feel to this image of the shirt. This is a nice shot of monochromatic clothes over kind of a pink wall, so the entire image itself is nice and monochromatic, which is really something that I really look for. But I'm going to up the contrast here by quite a bit and drop the highlights also by a lot so that we can get a little bit more kind of this detail, but not losing the actual monochromatic nature of it. Drop the shadows a little bit so that the kind of the robe, I guess here, separates from the shadow behind it, but as well as kind of the clothes themselves have a nice shaped shadow on the wall. Then we can up the whites and drop the blacks. Very simple. Suddenly, it's a lot more contrasty and kind of deep image, which I think adds to it, but doesn't lose the values of it being a monochromatic image. We have a scene here of a guy rolling out a cart of ice. I'm gonna up the contrast, drop the highlights by quite a bit because it was a bit overexposed and I wanna get details on the wall and on him. Drop the shadows a little bit to kind of create a bit more dramatic feel. We don't need to know where he's going in or coming out of. We just need to know that he's moving and where he's at. And I think the shadow creates a nice shape on this image of the whites and drop the blacks. So here we have a very nice kind of cinematic image. There's a story there now that I kind of took out the shadows, a little bit more interest in what he's actually doing rather than kind of literally what is happening, Does that make sense? Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. Another image that I've received some questions about is this guy throwing out the rope. So I just upped the contrast by +45 and dropped the highlights. We really needed to separate the rope from the wall of the boat behind it. Drop the shadows a little bit to kind of accentuate kind of this natural vignette we're seeing over the image due to my foreground objects and how the shadows lined up in the back. Up the whites and drop the blacks. So I really didn't do too much. I think just the shadows, highlights, and contrast here really kind of accentuate the shape of the rope between it and the background. It's a very warm image, but there still is a pure white kind of in some aspects of the image, as well as a pure black, and I think it's a very balanced image as well. Here's another favorite image, and I actually did a lot of editing to this one. It's a black and white shot, a little bit too bright, not super deep dramatically. So I dropped the exposure by 1.15, a little bit pushing my limits on that, up the contrast. But now we're dropping the highlights all the way down to -100. And what am I gonna do now is up the shadows. So now we have a very contrasty image to where the white values aren't lost, but we can also see kind of the obscured face of this man and woman that are in focus here in the center of the frame. Up the whites and drop the blacks just a little bit. And there we go. Very kind of interesting, dramatic image. And I needed to drop those whites and then bring back up the dark areas of the image in order to achieve that. What I want to accentuate here is the woman looking through the crowd at golden hour. So I'm going to drop the exposure just a little bit to get some more kind of contrast out of the images, the parts of the image that I want to hide. Up the contrast, now we're losing a lot. Drop the highlights, we're losing even more. And then up the shadows to 76 to get some of that stuff back, but the contrast is now present. So we up the whites just a little bit and drop the blacks. Now we can see all the details of her face, whereas like the guy next to her is a little bit more hidden and less distracting than he was in the original image. Here's kind of a sunset-ish photo. I mean, the sun is going down, it's golden hour. So let's drop the exposure here to get a little bit more of that detail at the top right by 0.85. Up the contrast, drop the highlights as we do, and then make up for that by bringing up the shadows a little bit. And now we can kind of see all the details that we're looking for. Up the whites and drop the blacks. Now there's some contrast and really nice color values, and we can kind of see where the light is shaping the image, which is what I was going for. Here's a very bright and sunny image of a guy walking onto a dock with a cigarette. We need to drop the exposure here so that we can really get all the details in there before we kind of affect how they look. So I'm gonna always up my contrast. I often drop highlights. I don't always exclusively do that, but dropping those highlights is gonna enable us to see the background a little bit better and the island and sailboats in the background. Up the shadows to get a little bit more detail on him as, you know, on his character. Up the whites and drop the blacks. Very contrasty image here. You know, I wish he wasn't right next to the red sign. He would stick out a little bit more, but this is a nice image, a lot of detail, and specifically his hand with the cigarette and whatever else is in his hand is very visible and sharp. So that's kind of what I was going for there. I mean, not a perfect image, but I like the edit. An image I've spoken of before, and I've gotten questions about how I achieved this effect. It's also on that same dock from the previous image. So I dropped the exposure just by 0.27, not by too much, up the contrast as I always do, and drop the highlights, which allows us to see the background even more and kind of this hazy effect that you see as we look down at kind of the horizon. Up the shadows to get more detail on the woman and on the guy on the boat as well. Up the whites and drop the blacks. So now we have kind of subtly contrasty image. It's not too dark, not too bright in various aspects. We do have a darker element and then the brighter sky, but nothing is lost into like getting blown out or kind of cranked down so much that you can't see it anymore. Here's a pretty matter-of-fact shot of kind of a little campo in Venice. It's a little overexposed though, so I'm going to drop the exposure by 0.45, just by half a stop. Up the contrast to 45 and drop the highlights quite a bit. That's going to bring out all the details that we're wanting to see kind of in this, I guess, awning and the building in the back. Then we're not going to touch the shadows. It's just not necessary. Up the whites and drop the blacks. And we have a subtly contrasty image with a lot of details that I think is really nice and kind of cinematic as well. Here we have an already contrasty image with a very bright background and kind of silhouetted figure at the front, but I'm going to drop the exposure just a little bit to get a little bit more detail out of the sailboats and the general background, which is what's in focus and what my subject really is. The contrast is going to go up a little bit more. Of those glimmers of light off the water are going to stick out. Drop the highlights, up the shadows so we get more detail there, whites and blacks up and down. And then we have a lot of nice color values. The blue really sticks out. The guy really sticks out, and we can see some color detail on his ear, on his hat that aren't just kind of blown out white. So this is a really nice image. Here we have a very dramatic picture of this guy waiting for a vaporetto. I've talked about this image before, but how did I edit it? Well, I had to up the exposure just a little bit to get some detail on kind of his forehead and the side of his face. So I plus 0.65, so basically half a stop up. Then we're gonna up that contrast, up the highlights this time, and we're gonna really just try to separate him from that bright background. And you know, we have a different side, you know, tinted background on the left. So that's kind of what makes this image a little bit more specific. Up the shadows to really get that detail that I was talking about on his face, on his arm, on his shirt even. up the whites, and then balance that kind of texture with the shadows by dropping the blacks to -31. And here we have a very contrasty image where you do have details of like of his cheek next to his nose, some of his shirt. You can see like where the kind of the line of his shirt is on his sleeve and everything. It is very detailed and quite dramatic and moody. Next, on that same dock, we have a few similar elements here in this image with kind of the very bright side on the left and kind of the tinted glass on in the center and the right. You can actually see me and my wife in this image as I'm taking the photo. So I'm gonna up the contrast to kind of hide myself a little bit to +46, drop the highlights, you get a little bit more detail on the left there, drop the shadows, and now you can kind of see that you can't really tell who I am in this image. But I kind of like that there's kind of a secret between us now that I'm actually in the shot. Up the whites and drop the blacks. Now you really can't see me or kind of figure out who I am. Maybe if you looked really, really closely, but only because you know it now. I don't think you would be able to tell at any other point. Really nice detail on his face. We can make sure we see all like the detail of his hair in the wind. And his glasses, I didn't want them to just all be black. I didn't want his face to just be pure silhouette. We get some details. We can see his ear. We can see all these elements that I think make the image work and stand out. I've talked about this photo as being one of my favorites of all time, and I stand by that. I just love the feeling it just gives me. It's already really strong without even editing the lighting, but I'm gonna go ahead and up the contrast and drop the highlights so we can get a little bit more detail on the boat and in the background, which I think is really nice, and kind of there's kind of a scope and a landscape here. Up the shadows so we see a little bit more of the foreground in this particular image. Up the whites and drop the blacks a little bit for some of that contrast. And there we go, a really, really deep image with some cinematic value and storytelling elements that, you know, we needed to bring some stuff from the front and from the back into, but it's not like changing these things really changed the story of the image. It just made it pop a little bit more. Next, we have a shot, very obstructed view of this guy of this gondolier going down a canal, kind of shooting through a hole in like a telephone box. So how can I try and accentuate kind of some of these details a little bit more? I'm gonna obviously up that contrast and drop those highlights just by 48. And then up the shadows just so we see a little bit more detail on the gondola and on the gondolier himself. Up the whites and drop the blacks. Maybe this image could have been better with how I took it, but I think this edit kind of shows a bit of the details with the color and makes the gondolier stand out. Overall, I do wish this photo was a little bit better though. Here is a nice shot of the Ducal Palace in San Marco in Venice, and it's a little bit overexposed, but I really have a nice kind of organic window frame through a doorway of this detail. So I'm going to up the contrast here by +41, which doesn't help my exposure problem, but dropping the highlights to -48 does. So now I see all the details on these columns, which are just beautiful, phenomenal. Up the shadows just a little bit, up the whites, and then drop the blacks just to add a little bit more detail. We can see a bird sitting on one of these kind of railings over here, but the columns are very detailed and kind of framed by this doorway, which I think is really, really neat. Looking out over Venice, we have a nice level of shallow depth of field here with these women taking photos of the view. I'm gonna up the contrast here so that we see a little bit more details in all these roofs that we're looking at, which are just stunning. Drop the highlights is gonna bring even more of that out, as well as in the deeper background as well. I'm putting the shadows at -1 just so I can say I did something to it this time, plus 10 on the whites and -17 on the blacks. And there's a lot of nice color quality, very cinematic value to this image. If you ask me, I like it. Now we're in a church and there's this beautiful organ, these pipes coming up with the light very motivated here. There's clearly a window behind these columns, which is super nice. So I'm going to up the exposure just by 0.1, just a smidge, and up the contrast, of course, which is going to take away a lot of that kind of bland aspect of the image already just by doing that. Drop the highlights by -48 by quite a bit. Now we see a lot more of those details. Up the shadows to +61, up the whites, and drop the blacks. So now we have a lot of detail, and those pipes really stick out from the background. They're shiny, they're textured. I think this is a really kind of interesting shot that is not just like, hey, here's an organ. It has some values to it with the shadow and kind of how it cuts across the image, but how you lose some details but accentuate other details. This shot is a little difficult because I'm shooting through glass at this guy working on the ropes of the Vaporetto. So there's a lot of reflection here, but kind of a lot of distortion, and the color quality isn't perfect because I'm shooting through a tinted glass and he's already kind of obstructed by some shadows and whatever else is going on. So I'm gonna up the exposure by 0.3 so we get a little bit more kind of light to work with. Up the contrast, of course, and I'm just gonna slightly slide the highlights down to -16. Up the shadows to get some more of those details. Up the whites and drop the blacks by -17. So here this creates contrast, but I couldn't overdo that like in some of the other images because we need the details of his shirt, of his face, to actually tell that there's a person there and kind of a little bit of what's going on. This is already a really contrasty image with the woman kind of silhouetted by kind of the brighter background sitting on the Vaporetto. The light is coming from behind her, but it's clearly so bright that she is very much in shadow. And we have a nice kind of layer of window to kind of frame this image. I'm going to up the contrast, which really loses her a lot. Drop the highlights so we get more detail on the water behind her. Then up the shadows so we get a little bit more of her back. We can see her glasses, we can see the shape of her face. And if you zoom in, you can see her ear and her other glass, but it's not the most important for me right now. Up the whites and drop the blacks just a little bit. And now we have a vibey image. I didn't want to, take back too much of her face. I think it works better with a little bit of this privacy and anonymity that we get from kind of losing her face to shadow, but we still see the figure and the shape and the pose that we have her in, and we're not losing that just by dropping a lot of the shadows and losing her face. An image I've gotten a lot of positive feedback on. We have all these light rays coming through the windows of the Vaporetto and a lot of layers here with the different rows of people and different levels of brightness. Some have a little bit of sun on them, some have a lot of sun on them. I'm going to up the exposure by +0.25 here and the contrast as well to +45 or +41. I'm going to go ahead and drop the highlights just a little bit here so that we get a little bit more of that detail on his face and on kind of the texture of the Vaporetto, of the water bus itself. Up the shadows a little bit, but that's not really going to do too much because there's so many dark elements of this image. Up the whites and drop the blacks a little bit, so really nice contrasty, and he sticks out way more than he did in the beginning, and these layers are accentuated much better than they had been previously. And now the green vibe really sticks out, and the skin tones also kind of create kind of a green-orange contrast, which are nice complementary colors that look really good together. I've spoken about this shot before. The original image is kind of overexposed here, so I'm going to drop it by a 0.4 on the exposure, so by half a stop more or less. Up the contrast and drop the highlights all the way down to -90. Now there's a lot of contrast on his face, but we can see the details of his ear, of his hair, which is what I was going for. Up the shadows a little bit so the other side of the man's face is not completely lost. Up the whites and drop the blacks a little bit. So now we have still a bit of this dramatic kind of contrast, but we're not losing any of the details of like his expression, which I think is what makes this image work. Kind of the tiredness, kind of grittiness, kind of what are you doing kind of element of this image. Another image I've spoken about before is this man waiting. There's a lot of dark and bright elements to this image that we need to balance. So I'm gonna up the exposure by 0.35, so not even by half a stop. Up the contrast, which really brings out kind of the dark elements of this image, but we're losing some of the detail on his shirt and his beard. And we get that back by dropping the highlights by -48. Up the shadows to kind of balance this a little bit, and I was really looking at this kind of lifesaver at the top right. Up the whites and drop the blacks just a little bit, so there's a really nice detail here. We can see everything in the dark aspects of the image and in the bright aspects of the image, where, like, you know, there's a really nice shadow from his nose over his face and from his hand back onto the palm of his hand. I think these are really nice details that I've been able to accentuate through this edit. We have this young kid waiting on a Vaporetto here, so I'm gonna up the contrast to separate him from that background and drop the highlights so we can see what the background actually is. Compensate +41 shadows, up the whites and drop the blacks. So now we have a very dramatic image with the shadow looking really nice, and we don't lose the details on his face. Here's a black and white image that needed a lot of work because as you can see, it's very kind of washed. I'm shooting through like 3 layers of glass here that really make this image super bright, but the guy's expression is super interesting to me, kind of this stoic nature. So I'm gonna up the contrast by 64, but as you can see, that doesn't do as much as I want it to. Drop the highlights, that doesn't do much either. Drop the shadows all the way to -89. We're getting a little bit more detail there, and I'm gonna really drop the blacks to -79, and that's what makes this image work for me. So a lot of editing on this image in particular compared to some of my other work, but that's really to get kind of the wash of all this glass away and bring out the detail of this guy's face, which was all hidden in the blacks. So there we go. We have a nice shot here of a pigeon in the rain. You can even see a couple raindrops here. Beautiful bokeh. So let's go ahead and up the contrast just by 30, a little bit less than I normally do. Drop the highlights as always, and then the shadows and the whites are gonna go up to +50 so we can really see all the detail of this bird, and then just drop the blacks just a smidge so that kind of the upper left and bottom right corners kind of create a nicer vignette to kind of frame this entire image as a whole. Lots of shadow and light to balance here. We have kind of the shadow of this woman's hand over her face is what I'm really interested in. She's got a hand up, she's got sunglasses and a hat. She's really not trying to see any sunlight today. So I'm gonna up the contrast and drop the highlights so we have a lot of the detail here. We also have a big church in the background that we want to see, you know, that it exists and that it's there. I'm gonna drop the shadows by -4. We've already done most of the job here with the highlights and the contrast. Up the whites and drop the blacks just a smidge. And here we have a nice contrasty image. The woman on the left, I don't even care. The character here is, you know, this woman's obstructed eyes. And I think we're losing some of those details. It kind of adds to the poetry of, like, she really didn't want light in her eyes. So that's what I'm going for here. Maybe it's not the best edit, but this is one thing that I did here to kind of manage all these layers and add a little bit of story and character to the image through what I'm thinking about it inside of my edit. Here we have a nice shot of a guy walking kind of solo in a bigger kind of area that's all like the same color, which is really nice. He's actually not in perfect focus, but still a good photo to edit. And let's see what we got here. I'm gonna up the contrast to really bring out his shadow there, drop the highlights as well so that, you know, it's not kind of a perfect white area. It was kind of a warm kind of colored rock. It's kind of like, it's not like a gray rock, it's kind of like an orangey rock. So I really wanted to bring that out there. Drop the shadows where he's already pretty dark and silhouette-y. Drop the whites just a little bit and the blacks here. We're dropping a lot here to kind of create this very, very kind of silhouette-y style image. Here's another shot that's like a touristy shot because I'm just getting kind of, well, it's not really a touristy shot. I'm trying to avoid taking touristy shots, but this is a shot of just like of a tourist attraction and of these columns, looking at columns through other columns with a nice shallow depth of field here. So I'm going to up the contrast here to kind of accentuate some of the shadows that we're going to bring back a little bit later. Drop the highlights to bring more details out of the brighter areas, and the shadows are going to go up to plus 71 so that we can see a little bit of what's on the left here, and we still have the contrast of kind of the darker areas underneath the arches that we're looking at. Drop the whites and the blacks just a little bit, and we have a nice deep contrasty image. What we're seeing on the left isn't quite as important, so it's a little bit darker because we're looking at other examples of these columns through these ones further in the image. Here's another image that I really liked, and I really had to edit it to make it sing a little bit. So we bring up the contrast here and drop the highlights, which are going to bring back some of the details in the kind of the rocky wall, like the wall, let's say on the bottom right. The shadows, I'm going to bring up all the way to plus 94 because I really wanted to see this tree on the left, and of course the dog itself was hidden in the shadows, but it's got this kind of weird expression here going on that I really liked with its mouth. Drop the whites and the blacks so we get a little bit more of that contrast back, but don't lose the detail that we took with the shadows. So this is how I edited this photo, which I think has a lot of story, a lot of layers, and I'm really happy with how I framed it up. So that's how I edited this image. We have a couple going down kind of this nice paved road. They're alone. There's nobody else in this shot, so it's kind of romantic. They're in the only beam of light that we can see. So I'm going to up that contrast to plus 51, drop the highlights to bring some of those details out, drop the shadows here so that we get a little bit more accentuation that they're in the only kind of light ray beam that I'm talking about here. Drop the whites a little bit. It was a bright day. Drop the blacks so that we're accentuating a little bit more of the deeper parts of the image, what's kind of further down this path versus what we're looking at as our primary subject here. Here we have a shot of a local Croatian man kind of in an old-timey kind of outfit with his groceries walking towards the camera. I wish I was a little bit further away for this shot, but a lot of little things here that don't fully change the entire aspect of the image, but make it sing a little bit more, upping that contrast, dropping the highlights, and bringing back some of the shadows. So we really kind of separate him from the background, dropping the whites a little bit and dropping the blacks again. So now we have a very kind of contrasty image, and he's very separated from his background, which is what was missing, but we don't lose the character and like the general feel of this image in black and white by doing that change. We have a boat here on the dock in Croatia, and we have a nice kind of foreground object that I have to balance the light with also like kind of this light reflecting off the water. So I'm going to up the contrast here, of course, to plus 50, drop the highlights to negative 62, so by quite a bit. Up the shadows to kind of bring some of those details in the reflection of the buoy, or I guess the buoy, you call that like the anchor, I don't know, and kind of the underside of this boat. See, we can still see the foreground object, and we can sort of actually tell what it is here, which is like a gas kind of pump. Drop the whites and the blacks a little bit, and here we have a nice image where you can tell what's in the front, you can tell all the details of the boat, but also there's such a beautiful color quality to the actual water that is kind of this bigger background that's covering a lot of the image. Here's a very vibey shot. There's a lot of cinematic quality and storytelling elements to this image. This hand of this driver, I'm looking perfectly through kind of the driver's side window. So I'm going to up that contrast, but not by too much, by plus 45. We're losing a little bit of the detail on his arm. It's a little over, so I'm going to drop those highlights to negative 78, and we can really see all these kind of wrinkles on his hand. It's just beautiful. Up the shadows to see a little bit more. We can see kind of his ear, the passenger as well. We can see the shape of their face on the right, we're gonna up whites by +14 and drop the blacks by quite a bit so that we can still see the details of like there's the other passenger, but they're a little bit more silhouette-y, and the main focus here is the guy's hand as he's driving, which I just think is a super cool vibe. Here's a really nice destination shot looking down from a bell tower to this church in Rovinj, Croatia. We can already see there's a nice, really magical value to the light here, how it's hitting the water, but also the top of this church and how it's kind of separated by just a very slight shallow depth of field. So I'm going to up the contrast by 45 and drop the highlights by almost 100 by 78. We're going to up the shadows, bring a little bit more of that detail back, just touch the whites up a little bit and drop the blacks by -50, so quite a bit, and that really makes the water kind of more vibrant and dark and kind of beautiful, and really make it seem kind of like a background for this church and the nice shape that we have of kind of this part of the church with the roof and the cross at the top right. Here is a very, very contrasty black and white image that I took looking up towards the sky. That's kind of what's creating this really dark element. So how am I going to manage that? I'm going to up the exposure by 0.85 by almost a stop. And then I'm going to also up the contrast. So we're like super in kind of white and black here with like the sky being totally blown out, but I'm going to drop the highlights and it's going to make the sky, instead of being this all white element, it's going to be kind of gray and we can see the clouds, and that's what's going to create a really nice kind of atmosphere here. Upping the shadows, now we can see a little bit more of their details. We can see a beard on his face, we can see her dress, but we can also see the hill at the bottom. There's stairs on the right, there's rocks, there's a lot more detail here. Upping the shadows, I had to go all the way +91 to achieve this. Up the whites and drop the blacks by 50. So now there's also some contrast within that hill and those stairs that we had to reveal by upping the shadows. This is a photo that I think has some pensive quality, but it just doesn't really shine without some editing. So I'm going to up the exposure by 0.45 by about half a stop, and that contrast by 38. Didn't want to overdo it here. I'm going to drop the highlights, which are going to maintain the details of the water in the background, by -88. Bring up the shadows quite a bit. I understand we have kind of an HDR feel here where we're kind of seeing details of everything, but I think in this particular image it works really well with +83 on the shadows, and we want to see kind of the shape of and details of this bike. We don't want it to all just kind of be lost because it's kind of a mess with the background. There's not like a pure like bright background or anything, which is something I often go for, but that doesn't exist here. So what we have here is a lot of details. Up the whites by +23 and drop the shadows by -22. And now suddenly it's a lot more interesting of an image than just kind of the flat image that we started out with. There's some story and it's a pensive photo. I think it's kind of interesting. This is another one of those black and white shots that is already just so contrasty and kind of dark. So I'm going to need to up the exposure by 0.5 here, by half a stop, by 0.55 really. Up the contrast by 38, and we can really see kind of the difference between the character here and kind of the really white water. So the highlights just by -19, we can see a little bit more detail of that water. Up the shadows to see, we can see a little bit more of his back, but mainly this is to see more of the trees that I'm using as kind of foreground layering objects. So you can see there's 3 trees here, 1 on the left, 2 on the right that are at different lengths. If you want to know why I'm not cropping the image down to the tree on the right, I've got other videos on layering and kind of this idea of layering an image from left to right as well. I'm gonna up the whites by +23 and subtly drop the blacks by -22. So now we have the details of this guy's back, of his body, but we can also see the background, the trees, everything is visible with this kind of contrasty, dramatic effect. So here's another image I've spoken about before. This very tired scuba instructor carrying a lot of things, about to put them in the bin to wash them. So I'm going to go ahead and up the contrast here because we want to separate him from that background, really accentuate his profile. I'm gonna drop the highlights as well, which is gonna help us achieve that even more, and up the shadows, which are gonna bring back some of those details on his actual like wetsuit, I guess. Yeah, it's wetsuit. It's kind of like the zippers and they kind of give it this like militaristic but kind of tired and textured feel. Up the whites and drop the blacks just a little bit, and that will create a kind of a very nice layered image where we can really see the guy's profile, the details, some water droplets coming off, but he's not blending in with the background. And you might have noticed that a lot of the edits are essentially very similar. I do a lot of the same style of editing, kind of dropping some highlights, kind of tweaking the shadows just a little bit. I try not to overdo the shadows because I do want to avoid that kind of HDR feel. And what I mean by that is just an image where you can see everything, kind of like on a phone, everything is visible. But in reality, a more artistic approach, you're kind of hiding certain details and bringing other ones out. And so a lot of what I'm doing is how can I create the contrast between different elements of the image, but not actually lose the values or like the details within those images, if that makes sense. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but I don't want the dark parts of an image to not have any details. Usually that's the case anyway. So this is kind of my method. I think once you like figure out how you like your images to look and what kind of edits you're doing to achieve that, yes, of course, a lot of the images are going to be kind of a copy paste and slight adjustment to that particular image. And granted, that's what I do. I figured out what I like to do with my lighting and with my coloring. So when I edit images, I have this basis point and then I edit from there. So that is what my recommendation would be. And hopefully you can kind of see a few different examples of how I achieve that with the slight little variations that I have in my work. And you find it interesting, I hope. And maybe you learned a little bit about photo editing in this video. My name's been Tony King. I hope you subscribe to this channel for more content. Well, not necessarily fully like this, but if you'd like to see a little bit more edits, or you have specific photos that you want me to show you how I edit, or if you'd like me to make this like kind of a periodic like catch up in how I edited photos and how my editing is developing, let me know in the comments. If you have other questions, let me know in the comments. But really, just subscribe because I'm going to answer all those questions in all sorts of videos. I don't know what I'm saying there, but anyway, I make a lot of photo content. I'd love for you to stick around for it. I've been Tony King.